I didn't know the marriage I was defending was already over. From the outside, everything looked stable, a shared home, shared plans, a future that made sense on paper. I kept telling myself that loyalty meant patience, and silence meant strength, until one unexpected conversation changed everything. Not a fight. Not an accusation. Just a quiet warning from someone who thought I deserved to know the truth. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't about to lose my marriage. I was about to find myself. I never imagined my marriage would unravel in a quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just one sentence that split my life cleanly in two. At the time, I was 32, living in Portland, juggling a demanding job in operations management, and a marriage that looked stable from the outside. My husband, Evan, and I had been together for nearly 7 years. We shared a townhouse, mutual friends, and a carefully curated image of doing just fine. Or so I thought. That afternoon, I had agreed to meet Daniel, one of Evan's longtime friends. He texted me earlier, saying he needed to talk, alone. His message felt urgent, but vague enough that I assumed it was about Evan's upcoming work trip, or some minor crisis. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, sitting stiffly by the window, his untouched coffee growing cold. He didn't smile when he saw me. Instead, he said my name the way people do when they're about to deliver bad news. "I've been going back and forth about telling you this," he began. "But I can't stay quiet anymore." My stomach tightened. I waited. Then he leaned forward and said, "Evan doesn't think you'll ever leave him. That's why he never stopped." I blinked. "Never stopped what?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "Seeing other women." The words landed without sound, like something heavy sinking underwater. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. I just sat there, staring at the steam rising from my cup, realizing that the life I'd been defending for years might have been a lie I'd been protecting alone. Daniel rushed to explain himself. "He asked me to talk you out of divorcing him, said you'd listen to me, said you were emotional right now." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about how little he thought of me. I looked up at Daniel and asked calmly, "Is that everything?" He nodded, clearly relieved to have finally said it out loud. I thanked him for his honesty, stood up, and walked out without another word. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd already made my decision. And it would cost them both more than they expected. I didn't go home right away. I walked for nearly an hour, letting the drizzle soak through my jacket, replaying Daniel's words over and over in my head. He doesn't think you'll ever leave him. That sentence hurt more than the cheating. When I finally unlocked the front door, the house felt exactly the same, clean, familiar, staged. The kind of space that looks peaceful when nothing is being questioned. Evan wasn't home, yet. I set my bag down slowly, and sat at the kitchen island, staring at the small calendar magnet still marked with our upcoming anniversary. 8 years together. A weekend trip already paid for, non-refundable. I laughed once. Quietly. Then I opened my laptop. Not because I was emotional. Because I was done being unprepared. For years, I had handled most of our logistics, utilities, insurance, shared accounts. Evan liked to joke that I was the organized one. What he really meant was that I carried the weight, so he didn't have to. It didn't take long to find what I wasn't supposed to see. Receipts buried in shared expense folders. Late night ride charges logged to addresses I didn't recognize. And eventually, a storage unit rental under his name. That one stopped me cold. People don't rent storage units unless they're hiding something. By the time Evan came home that evening, I had already made copies of everything. He kissed my cheek, asked about my day, and complained about traffic like he always did. I responded on autopilot. I served dinner. I smiled at the right moments. I listened. Inside, something had gone very quiet. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I opened my phone and searched his name online, not in panic, but with purpose. That's when I saw it. A public comment on a photo posted weeks earlier, a woman's name I didn't recognize. A heart emoji he'd never used with me. It was small. Easy to miss. But it confirmed what Daniel had said. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I locked my phone and lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, realizing something that scared me more than the betrayal itself. I had been living in a marriage where I was useful, but optional. And the worst part? He thought I'd never notice. Or worse, that I'd notice and stay anyway. I didn't confront Evan the next day. Or the day after that. I needed him comfortable. Predictable. That Saturday morning, he suggested brunch like nothing had happened. We sat across from each other at our usual spot, sunlight pouring through the windows, couples laughing around us. If anyone had looked our way, they would have seen a normal marriage. That was the problem. So, he said casually, stirring his coffee, Daniel mentioned you two met this week. I kept my expression neutral. He did. Evan nodded, a little too quickly. He worries too much. Always dramatic. I smiled. Yeah, I said. I've noticed. That was the moment I realized he had rehearsed this. He already knew the conversation existed. He just didn't know what had been said. After brunch, Evan left to run errands. I went home and did something I should have done years ago. I called a lawyer, not to file anything yet, just to understand my options. What separation would look like. What documentation mattered. What timelines actually protected me. By the end of the call, my hands were steady. That night, Evan tried harder than usual. He cooked dinner, opened a bottle of wine, told stories about work like he was auditioning for the role of a devoted husband. I watched him carefully. When he reached across the table and said, "You know I'd never do anything to hurt you, right?" I met his eyes. "That's interesting," I said, "because you seem very confident I'd forgive you if you did." His smile faltered, just for a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked. I stood and began clearing the plates. "It means," I said lightly, "you know me well enough to assume I'll stay quiet." He laughed, but it sounded wrong, forced. Later, as I got ready for bed, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You don't know me, but you deserve the truth. Ask your husband about the apartment on West Alder." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I set the phone down. Because I didn't need more proof. I already had enough. What I needed now was timing. And Evan had no idea how little of it he had left. I didn't wait for Evan to confess. I invited him to. The following Thursday, I suggested dinner at home. No phones. No distractions. Just us. He agreed immediately, too quickly. We ate in near silence, the kind that fills a room when both people know something is coming, but neither wants to say it first. After the plates were cleared, I sat back and folded my hands. "Tell me about the apartment on West Alder," I said. The color drained from his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, almost reflexively. I nodded slowly. "Okay. Then tell me about the storage unit. Or the rides. Or the woman who keeps commenting on your photos." His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell the truth. Instead, he sighed and leaned back like the conversation was exhausting him. "You've been distant," he said. "You're always working." I didn't think it mattered. That was when I understood something clearly. He wasn't sorry. He was inconvenienced. "I didn't ask why you did it," I said calmly. "I asked if you did." Silence. Finally, he nodded. "Once. Yes." The word hung between us. "I never planned to leave you," he added quickly. "It didn't mean anything." I smiled faintly. "That's the problem," I said. "You didn't think I meant anything either." He stood, pacing the room. "Daniel went behind my back. He had no right to involve you." I met his gaze. "You involved me the moment you lied." That night, I packed a bag. Not out of panic. Out of clarity. Evan followed me to the door, his voice low and urgent. You're really going to destroy everything over this? I zipped the bag and looked at him, one last time. No, I said. I'm refusing to pretend nothing's broken. I left the keys on the counter. By the next morning, Evan had tried to call me 16 times. Daniel sent one message. I'm sorry. I thought I was helping. I replied with a single sentence. You didn't break my marriage. You just revealed it. That was the moment both relationships ended. I moved into a small furnished apartment on the east side of the city. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't impressive. But it was mine. The first few weeks were strange. There were moments when silence felt heavy, when I reached for my phone out of habit, expecting a message that never came. Then slowly, the quiet began to feel like relief. Evan didn't fight the separation. That told me everything I needed to know. The paperwork moved quickly. No dramatic arguments, no long emails trying to explain feelings that should have been obvious years ago. Just signatures. And distance. At work, something shifted. Without the constant emotional weight of trying to hold a marriage together, I had focus again. I accepted a role that required travel, something I turned down before because it wasn't a good time. Turns out, it was the perfect time. I ran into Daniel once, months later, outside a grocery store. He looked uncomfortable. Smaller. I never meant for things to end like that, he said. I nodded. I know. Then I added, gently, but you don't get credit for honesty when it comes with an agenda. He didn't argue. That was the last conversation we ever had. One evening, after a long day, I sat on my balcony with a cup of tea and watched the city lights come on. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who stayed because it was easier than starting over, the one who believed loyalty meant endurance. She had done the best she could with what she knew. But she wasn't who I was anymore. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. It's about the moment you realize that being chosen by yourself is the only validation that matters. I didn't destroy two relationships. I walked away from ones that were already hollow. And in doing that, I finally chose a life that didn't require me to disappear to survive.